Okay, so for our next chapter, we're going to be covering, our next topic will be identifying interests and operationalizing topics. So forget that perfect study. That's one of the things we sort of talked about the first night of classes, getting over the fact that we're not going to be able to create a perfect study. It's just not in the cards. Research is something that is pretty muddy. It is ambiguous. It is not black and white. It is not simple. And so I think, again, it's analogous, as I've said in the past few videos, to that of counseling, and that we're not going to be, shut that off. It's not something, we're not going to walk in with a client and it's going to be just, oh, I know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing with them, or it's not going to be clear cut exactly what they're coming in with, and that's kind of what research is as well. So we want to first start to identify research topics that we're interested in. So a wide range of experience can play a role in helping the researcher to develop research ideas. So from the beginning, if you're not involved in a lot of applied research, then you may not have a wide exposure to the research that you might be interested in. Sometimes developing research ideas may seem difficult for inexperienced researchers, and they may cringe at the thought of developing an original research idea that no one has done before. And it's interesting, and I think that that's actually a lot of fun, is to be able to figure out ways we can measure or quantify variables, and then measure those variables to see kind of what's happening within a new construct or a new thought paradigm. And for those of you who are going to go into a doctoral program, this is exactly what a dissertation is. It's this creation of some sort of research idea that nobody has had before, or nobody has completed before, or it's done in a way that nobody has done it before. So it needs to be novel, and it needs to be new. So it's something that you want to start thinking about. So several characteristics differentiate the experienced researcher from the inexperienced researcher. And the experienced researcher usually has a large knowledge base, not only about a given topic, but also about several other topics. And not because they're smarter or anything like that, it's just because they have more experience in it. Just like our counselors who have been practicing for 10 plus years, they're going to have a very different skill set than our new counselors who are coming right out of a master's program, simply because they've been doing this for so long. So, for example, my research started out very myopically in looking at outcome measures for supervision sessions. And that grew into trying to find efficacy within a model, a supervision model that I've been using for a number of years, which then grew into several other areas of research, mostly around assessments. That's kind of what I'm most interested in. And I've been able to become an expert in several different areas because of the research that I was involved in with other individuals and other professors and other students. And it's solely just because I've had the opportunity to experience that. And so hopefully you, through this class and then through being part of other research projects, will begin to build on that knowledge and be able to hopefully feel empowered to start researching on your own. Because you don't need to have a professor, you don't need to have somebody else to conduct research. You just need to make sure that you have IRB approval to conduct any research, and after that, just follow what you're learning. So the last part of this slide, the researcher can most likely process information about these topics in a sophisticated way, identifying the most important findings, combining research findings, dovetailing ideas from one topic to another, elaborating or extending ideas in novel ways. And I think that it's important because I remember when I first got into my master's program and I was doing some research and then really got into my doc program, and I was always in awe with the professors who I could bring them a research idea and I'd be like, this is what I want to do. And they would just look at me and kind of be like, well, no, what about this and what about that? And they would kind of twist it in a way or change it in a way that I never thought. And I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, that makes so much sense. And how do they know this? And then I started obviously thinking the whole imposter syndrome, like, oh, I'm not smart enough, or I don't know what I'm doing. And I see that now. I do that with students when they have research topics, and it's purely and simply based on the experience that we have had or that I have gone through that allows me to see things from a research perspective in different ways. And that lens or that ability to to look at things in that different way, you will gain that as well the more you engage in research. The experienced counseling researcher often has a considerable wealth of information from his or her applied counseling experiences that can be the source of many ideas and hypotheses. And that's what's really, really great, because you're going to encounter human beings on a regular basis. So you're going to see and you're going to hear things that are going to pique your interest. And then you'll be able to go through processes to start researching what those things are. The veteran researcher also typically knows a great deal about the skills needed to conduct research, such as knowledge of research designs, methodology, assessment, statistics, data collection, data analysis, and the technical writing piece. So what we want to do is we want to be able to become as experienced in each one of these areas, in the designing of the research, the methodological approaches, how we're going to combine or use assessments, statistics. And I know that for some people is a anxiety producing word. And one thing that I do like to talk about a little bit in the 508 class, and now we'll talk maybe a little bit in the 509 about statistics, that you don't need to be able to complete the mathematic computation of whatever statistic you're going to use. For example, if you're going to use a Mancova, which is a multivariate analysis with a covariant piece attached to it, I don't expect you to be able to mathematically figure that out on your own. I mean, I can't mathematically figure that out on my own. What we need to know in statistics from an applied standpoint is, what do the values mean that are being spit out by SPSS or Minitab? That's what we need to be knowledgeable of. So if you see a p-value of, or an f-value of, or if you're looking at the r-squared value, or eta, or theta, or beta, what do these things mean? Because they can all tell you a great deal about what is going on with your data, and in ways that other people, if you don't know and you put data out there that are incorrect, then that other people may have the ability to read and decipher your data in a way that you couldn't, and then you could be discredited for that. So it's always good to have somebody who has that statistical background that can help out with that, if you don't have that, and then try to figure it out and learn from that as well. There are certain values. One thing that we talked about was the first class was measuring the homogeneity of a variable. And basically, what that is saying is that are the populations that were collected for your samples, are they within the normal standardized bell curve, or do we have a skewed data set, or a data set that is outside of the norm? And there are certain tolerances that we can look at with that. That will tell you where kind of your data fall, and if you can use it. And if you find that you have this tolerance that is outside of our normal standards, and you're using these data, then somebody can come back and say that this study is not valid, because the data that were used were not valid data. So, and if they're not valid, it's very easy to transform and transcribe those data to make them normalized. For example, Dr. Hamlet and I were working on a project not too long ago, and our data fell off the value curve of the tolerance where we wanted to be. And usually we look at this one statistic, and it needs to fall within, usually between 0 and 5, and anything after 5 indicates that there might be some skewness, and anything after 10 just tells us that there's something not right about the sample that we got. But using a box-Cox transformation, you could take those data and rework them into a formulation that gives you a tolerance level below 5, and we were able to do that, and therefore we were able to get some really interesting data analysis from that. So that all being said, again, kind of as I said earlier about research in general, the more experience that you have with the statistics, the more experience that you have working in these different ways, the more knowledge you're going to have, and the easier it becomes. So if stats right now is something that you're like, oh my gosh, it's too much, be aware that if you go to a doc program, you'll have to take stats classes. Depending on the program, it could be one class, it could be many classes. We had to take, in my doc program, we had to take 3 quantitative statistics classes, 2 qualitative statistics, and I know that doesn't really sound right, but they had to do with using Atlas TI. And then we had 2 advanced research classes. So we had a very high focus on methodological design, research design, statistics, understanding what everything read. Now that's not every program. have some colleagues that they had a combined statistics and research class, and that's it. That's all they got. So as you're looking at doc programs where the foci of the program lie, we could have conversations about those things. So the inexperienced researcher has far less knowledge about specific research topics and often has trouble identifying the most important or relevant information. A lot of times I find that neophyte counselors, neophyte researchers really focus on things that they're interested in, which is great, and that's wonderful. There's nothing wrong with that, but we may not be able to capture those data efficiently or effectively. The novice often has less applied experience in counseling, and most have less developed conceptualizations of the counseling process. And so that could lead into when we're trying to study clinical populations. In fact, in many counseling programs, well-articulated guidelines for conducting research are not available to students, leaving the impression that research process is rather mystical. And I think that's the same thing for getting into a doc program as well. We don't really talk about it too much, and so what happens is that this process that is mystical or magical, and we need somebody to kind of guide us along that path, and that's what your professors are here for, is to kind of help you through that. But it doesn't have to be that way. And conducting research doesn't have to be that way as well. It doesn't need to be just for the few, it can be for the many. So a necessary first step in identifying possible research topic is to start collecting information about any previous research, both within and outside of counseling. So one of the things that we'll do soon in class is we'll kind of play around with searching for literature, and what's the difference if we just look within psych articles, or if we're able to go outside of that and start looking and into other journals and other areas of specialty. So we want to be able to have some kind of strategy that helps us to look for more focused literature reviews on specific topics, but while also being able to explore it in many different areas. And books on specific topics are often useful resources as well. One of the things, and this is a trick that I like to do, if I find a great article, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to their reference page at the end and see what they use as their references, and I'll start going through those references and see what's happening. If the lit review's been done, we need to do it for a research project, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel and start searching blindly. We can use the research that's done to find out what research they looked at that informed them of where they were going. In addition to examining what kind of research has already been done, it's also important to get a sense of what kind of research grant funding agencies have identified as new and important topics that merit investigation. And so this is looking at the grants that are available through the government, and what happens is they'll often put out grants for several $1,000s, could be hundreds of $1,000s, in areas that they want to give money to researchers so that they can explore those areas. And so what we do is we can look at that to see, okay, what's important right now to the NIH or SAMHSA or any of the government agencies that are trying to look for researchers to conduct this research. And it's important to get a better understanding of what kind of topics are currently valued by funding agencies, which will become more important the longer that you get into academia. So I apologize if you hear music outside. We have workers painting the windows right outside of my office, and they have very loud music playing out there, so I do apologize about that. Capitalizing on faculty and student resources is one approach, and so basically what that means is that allowing students should feel empowered to approach their professors about different research topics that they're interested in, and finding out if the faculty will help them through. So in this class, we're going to do a research project together so that we can all say that we've been through that process and you get that experience of it. If there's something that you're interested in and you have a professor that you think might be able to help you get the research started, by all means, I would ask them. Again, we are all in our positions because we're not only practitioners, but we're academics and we're scholars as well, so we do engage in research quite often. But what I would say is that don't be discouraged if a faculty member tells you that they can't at this time, because we get many requests from many students to do research, and sometimes between teaching, between all the different service positions that we have throughout the campus, we may not have time. And for me, especially, I know when a student comes to me and asks I would like to do research. It's very difficult for me to say no because I really enjoy the research process, but I will often tell a student I can't engage in a research project with them at this time because I can't give them the attention that would be needed for that project. And to do research half-assed is not really worth it because then you lose interest in it, I lose interest in it, and then it sits on the back burner for too long. So one of the best strategies is to begin research training by working closely with an advisor's research interests. And it looks more like an apprenticeship model. And this is what I did in my master's and my doctoral program. I knew that the things that I wanted to look at and I was interested in were not going to be of interest of others, and we may not be able to take a look at them. But in the future, I would definitely be able to look at them. So just getting the experience of working with my mentors and what they were working on gave me the ability and empowered me to want to go on my own and start doing my own research. So while you're reading and you're thinking about previous research in counseling or whatever your research topic may be, it's important to keep in mind these 4 issues. The first thing is the utility of the research in answering real-life applied questions that address important societal needs. You also have to take in one's particular interests. One of the worst things to do is to work on a research project that you have no interest in because it won't sustain you. You'll get bored and you may not want to continue doing research. It's also a way that we're going to build on previous research, and that there is a role of theory or how we work with the research in and of itself. But one of the most basic reasons for conducting research is to develop this knowledge base that in one way or another can help people by addressing pressing societal needs. And in counseling, that's typically what we can conduct research on. So specifying research questions and then hypotheses. So after identifying a possible research topic, it's important that we should become knowledgeable about previous research on that topic, perhaps even by writing a formal review paper. Examining key studies is essential because you want to make sure that what you're researching is actually important to the population as a whole, not just something that I'm interested in by myself. And B, that it hasn't been done before. Like I said in class, and I said in a previous video, this qualitative study of mothers' lived experiences in doctoral programs has been done over and over and over and over again. And so, how is this advancing if we keep hearing the same thing over and over again? How is it advancing the field? And it may not be. Pay particular attention to the discussion sections of these studies. A lot of times you will hear, if you read the discussion, so for me, I love the results in the discussion sessions of papers because the results obviously tell me what happened, what they were able to do, but the discussion tells me where we should go next. And a lot of times our researchers will say, we should go here, we should start looking there. And so that might be a good indicator for you of where we need to go. And it's a good place to start getting those ideas. So research questions are the key elements in developing a topic area, and in essence are the questions that explore the relationships among or between constructs, right? Research questions. In contrast, the research hypothesis is more specific in that it states the expected relationship between the constructs. We talked about this a little bit in a previous video, and I think a little bit the other night. Research questions are basically what we have in qualitative work, right? And so we're trying to understand developing a topic area, the lived experience, we're exploring relations in that, and then in a research hypothesis is what we use in quantitative work, where we're going to be able to state what we believe is going to happen, and then mathematically or statistically, we can show that we've either supported our research hypothesis, the alternative hypothesis, and then we can reject the null hypothesis. So Drew in 1980, which again, most of you probably have never seen 1980 before, has identified 3 useful general categories for research questions, that being descriptive, difference, or relationship. So descriptive questions essentially ask what some phenomena or events are like. So sometimes researchers have questions about counseling events or phenomena that are best answered by collecting information through inventory, surveys, interviews to best describe those events. Difference questions ask if there's a difference between groups of people or even within individual participants. So the key feature in this type of question is the comparison of some sort. And relationship questions explore the degree to which 2 or more constructs are related or they vary together. So such questions tend to use correlational statistics or more complex regressional analysis. When you hear regression analysis, people sometimes get really scared by that because it sounds like it's it's complicated. But basically, correlation just tells you the relationship between two variables, and the regression analysis is a predictive model through those correlation statistics. So we look at how much those correlations, how much A is moving B in a positive or negative direction over how many units over time, and then from that we can actually predict what things are going to be like, and that's where we get these regression analyses. So they're basically just a takeoff of correlations, much like when we talk about ANOVAs and MANOVAs and ANCOVAs, and MANCOVAs are just a takeoff of the t-test. They're just many t-tests that are pulling into one section, into one analysis. So if you know what a t-test is, comparing two different groups to see if they're different or like, and then correlation, looking at two different variables to see if there's some kind of relationship between them, those are the two basics really of our statistical analysis that we use. 90% of our statistics will come from either the t-test or the correlation. But then when we start adding more variables in, or if we want to know a little bit of different information, that's when we start getting into the MANOVAs, the ANOVAs, the ANCOVAs, the MANCOVAs, the regression analysis, hierarchical regression analyses, conical regression, all of these different ways, and all it is just based off of those two simple tests. So we have our one family of t-tests that's very linear, and then we have one test of correlations which are linear, and they don't cross paths. So you won't use correlation, well, I shouldn't say that, in an ANOVA when you get a positive F statistic that is statistically significant. You will then look at the data and then have correlative relationships among those to figure out exactly what's going on, but typically they don't cross over boundaries with each other. So we want to create a testable research question. So we want to have these few things. So we want a question that asks about a question about the relationship between two or more constructs that can be measured in some way. So it's a question about two or more constructs that can be measured. And that's a good research question. So first, the question should be worded clearly, unambiguously, in a question form. And that's sometimes a difficult thing to do because we tend to, especially at the graduate level, write very technically and sometimes flowery speech. And so when we're writing research questions, we want them to be as plain, simple, and succinct as possible. Secondly, the research question should inquire about a relationship between two or more constructs, like whether asking construct A is somehow related to construct B. Finally, not only is the relationship between the constructs examined, but somehow how is this relationship measurable, or to what degree are they somehow related? So, and the function of a testable research question or hypothesis is provided the direction into the experimental inquiry as well. So, so the question of the hypothesis not only identifies the topic, but it also identifies specific constructs of interest within that topic. So one of the other things that we have to do is formulate operational definitions. And so after the development of the question or the hypothesis, it's crucial that all terms or constructs in the question be defined concretely so the research idea can be empirically tested. So you'll have to, if you're measuring the variable of X, you have to be able to list what is X, what are the terms, what are the operational definitions that you are using for X, because my X might be different from your X in construct, so you need to make sure that we're defining those well. So Kurlinger referred to the operational definitions as a sort of manual of instructions that spell out what the investigator must do to measure or manipulate the variables during the procedures of said study. Some more things we have to do are to identify independent and dependent variables. And I know we review this, we go over it in 508. I'm sure you've had it in your undergrad class, but it does confuse some people. So let's go over independent variables and dependent variables. But they're both used in experimental descriptive research to define different types of variables. So in a true experimental design, the researcher attempts to examine causality by systematically varying or altering one variable or a set of variables and examining the result changes in or the consequences for other variables or sets of variables. So basically what we're looking is one variable's change on another variable. So how does A change B, or how does A, B, and C change variable D? And the independent variable is the variable that is manipulated or controlled within a study. So usually an experiment will involve two or more levels of independent variables. These are sometimes referred to as conditions, like treatment or no treatment. But the researcher is going to do something to either manipulate or change that independent variable, or to control to make sure that it is not changed. In experimental studies, changes in the dependent variable are supposed to depend on the influence or being changed, what's being changed in the independent variable. So the dependent variable is our variable that we measure. That's going to be the one that we focus on. The dependent variable is dependent upon the independent variable for change. So the independent variable is free to vary however it likes to. And however the independent variable is going to vary or change will then affect the dependent variable. We want to see to what extent does the independent variable then change or alter the dependent variable. So I hope that makes sense. So in a true experimental design, we would purposely change one of the independent variables to see how that dependent variable changes as well. So we're not going to do anything to the dependent variable except observe. That's the only thing we do with the dependent variable. Independent variables, we can do whatever we want. We can change, we can move, we can control so that nothing happens to the independent variable as well, putting it into environments where it would normally change, and then by controlling for it to not change and measuring the dependent variable, we can see that is it truly the independent variable? So let's think about that for a sec. So if we have an environment that would change an independent variable and we control the independent variable so it does not change at all, and we see that the dependent variable doesn't change, then we can say that there is a relationship between those two. If, by chance, we're using an environment that there's a lot of change, the independent variable we were controlling so it doesn't change, but then we see the dependent variable is still changing even though the independent variable is not changing, that tells us that there are some latent variables or there are some extraneous variables within that environment that are causing the change on the dependent variable. It's not the independent variable. So when something like that happens, we have to then go back to our research design and say, is there something that was there a misstep in the research design, or is there something that we're not aware of within the environment that is causing these changes, and can we control those changes, or can we not control those changes? And those are all questions that will have to be asked. So once we're ready, once we have our experiment set up and we have our hypothesis, we have to go through the process of data collection. And so this starts out with by defining our target population or a sample that we're going to take. Rarely do we have the ability to just go out and just survey any random person. We usually want to be targeted in what we're studying. So we're going to create some kind of participant pool. We're going to talk about how we're going to select the participants for this sample pool, and also determine the number of participants. So if we remember back to first class when we were kind of going through D2L, I showed you G-Power. There's a link there, and that is a downloadable program, and it's free, and it's old, but it works well. And you can put different parameters of your research study in there, and then just hit a button and it'll tell you how many, a minimum of an N, that you will need to have a powerful study. So there are ways that we can tell. Typically, when we're running a quantitative study, I would say probably about 55 to 60 would be the minimum that you want, depending on how many levels of variables or how many conditions you have. The more conditions, the more participants you're going to need. And then in qualitative, if you're anywhere between 5 and 10, you're going to be in good shape there. The data collection decision will also depend on the design of the experiment as well. So the design must be determined first, and then the final step will be the analysis of the data once they are collected. So once the data are collected, sense must be made of them. So a lot of times we just have all of these numbers on a spreadsheet somewhere, and we have to figure out what we're going to do. So what we want to do is index the characteristics of the participants. And so within each column, within each variable, we're going to want to, again, define what those variables are. So if we're using a 1 to 5 Likert scale, well, we know 1 might be never and 5 might be always, and then everything kind of falls in the continuum in between. We're going to want to define those variables, so that we can, so that when we put the data through, we're not like, 3 is highly correlated with 7. Okay, what does that mean? So once we put in the index and we could say, oh, eating cheese is correlated to higher levels of cholesterol in the blood. So the data are summarized and analyzed. We don't, when we report on our data, we're not just going to report on every single thing that's in there. We're going to report summaries and findings that we find to be significant. So that's that. So that's how we're going to start identifying interests and topics, and forgetting that there is no such thing as the perfect study. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about neophyte researchers and how they feel that they are creating, or they're able to create, a better or the best research study for whatever population it is, and that actually can handcuff us and lead to a lot of bias in our research. So I hope you found this video interesting and useful, and stay tuned for more videos.